Hey everybody, Jeff here from therevitKid.com. Today I'm going to do something just a little bit different. I always get requests about how I actually use Revit when I'm designing buildings. So what I thought I would do is take a recent project that I designed. It's currently in schematic design phase. So today I'm going to pull back the curtain and I'm going to show you each step of my design process. The project that we're going to be looking into is called Stilted Studios. This is a small, fun little residential project that I think is a perfect example of how Revit can be used in your design process. Before we jump into the video, if you like what you see, please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel below, as well as check out all the links in the description and the comments below. There's going to be a lot of references of different software and different pieces of information, and so I really want you to check those out. The other thing I want you to do is check out my video series called BIM After Dark Volume 1. Summer enrollment for the course is going to be open soon, and if you like what you see in this video, you're definitely going to like how I dig in deep into presentation techniques, rendering, and so on with Revit. To find out more, make sure you check out the link below and tell me what you think. So now let's talk a little bit about the project. The project, which I'm calling Stilted Studios, is located in northern Connecticut, in the hills of Connecticut if you're familiar with the area, and is located on a dramatically sloping southern site. The existing house is a 1970s contemporary house. It's got a split shed roof, so with some clear stories to the north. And for the most part, the only work that we're going to be doing to the house is just replacing the siding or painting the siding. They've done a lot of great stuff on the interior to keep it up and contemporary, but the project that I'm actually going to be walking through is a detached studio for an art studio and a yoga studio. The husband is actually an artist, really great portrait artist, and the wife teaches yoga classes. So the ask was actually pretty simple, or I shouldn't say pretty simple. It wasn't very detailed. It was, I want a detached building that I can use for art and yoga, and then I also want it to be looking down the southern view. There's a dramatic slope, like I said. It's a couple hundred feet actually on the south side of the property, and it overlooks a couple streams, and it's very bucolic looking. And for Connecticut, if you're familiar with the area, you can actually see a lot of the rolling hills, which is very nice. The streams flow into the Farmington River, so it's an absolutely beautiful site. So really the ask was, I want to create, or can you create for me? So can I create a space that takes advantage of the views, makes you feel secluded and in the woods, and also continues this contemporary flair while not sticking out too much. So the design that I came up with is actually two boxes. They're basically shed roof masses, and in order to keep things on budget, I made the masses the exact same shape, except they're just mirrored and rotated and shifted down the hill. And so as we go through the project, you'll see that a little bit, as well as the diagram I'm showing on screen right now. But what this did is it took two of the same masses, which are roughly 14 by 14 feet, and made a dramatically different approach to the project. It also, by tilting them away from each other, the yoga studio has a view out towards the woods, and the art studio has a view out towards a different piece of the woods, and they never really look at each other. And when you're in this space, it'll feel like you're looking directly into nature, and you won't see any neighbors or any other structures. So step one in my design process, believe it or not, I know, the Revit kid, actually starts with this. Yes, I always start designing, even though I am the biggest Revit proponent you will ever meet, I always start designing with a roll of trace and a bunch of pens and my mind and my hands. Lately, I've actually been getting into using toned paper. And so this is kind of cool. It's a little bit of a different medium. For those of you who are really into sketching, I definitely suggest you try it out. I'd like to thank Eric Reinholdt at a 30 by 40 Design Studio. He's got a great YouTube channel. Make sure you check it out. I'll link that below as well. But I really got into using this sort of craft paper for sketching this project. What's nice about the craft paper is that you have the ability to use white on it. So you can do things like highlighting and even using notes with white. It just adds a nice dynamicism, I guess. Dynamic. It makes your drawings a little more dynamic. My sketching process is probably very similar to those of you who have gone through a design studio or are architects. You probably use a very similar process as me. I usually start with some sort of a diagram that I'm either seeing in my mind or I saw when I was at the site or something. Usually it's a plan or a section, a very simple sort of box plan or section. And then from there I start drawing different and sketching out different ideas. Maybe I'll cut a section through it. Maybe I'll show like a elevation. You know, depending on the building, the design sort of develops through various different views when I'm sketching. This project, it started with sort of a plan of 2 boxes, and I sort of messed with them a little bit. I kinked them, I moved them around, and then I started drawing. I think it was an axon because for some reason I really wanted to see these 2 masses together. And then from there I started developing some elevations and so on and so forth. The nice thing about sketching over jumping right into the computer, and you'll see step 2 we do go into Revit, but on step 1 the nice thing about sketching is that you don't have to worry about scale. As much as I am a huge proponent of Revit, and I do believe that Revit is not limiting to your modeling processes or your shapes. A lot of people say it's very limiting, it's very boxy. As long as you know how to use it, you can pretty much make anything you want in Revit. But when you jump into the computer in general, you're usually starting to hold constraints of scale. So you're almost immediately, even if you're drawing a box in Revit, or even if you're drawing a box in any other 3D modeling program, you have to input the dimensions of that box. So the nice thing about starting with sketching with your hand is that you actually are not constrained to that scale. Yes, you need to think about it. You can start looking at relationships of boxes and things like that. I'll sketch in some people just to give my idea, my thoughts a relative scale. But you're not constrained to it. So that's the key there, is that I always start with paper. I usually start with a simple diagram that sort of drives everything, and then I develop back from there. In step 2 is when we start jumping into the computer. It's a 5-step process that is typically linear, but when you get to step 2, it becomes an iterative process with step 1. So I'm going to jump into Revit, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create what I call a sketch mass or a sketch model. Some of you may be familiar with sketch modeling from when you were in architecture school, where you rip up pieces of paper, you put them together, you make all kinds of things. I like to do it in Revit because then I can manipulate it quickly, but then I can also utilize that mass moving forward, which you'll see in step 3. So right now we're going to look at the sketch model that I created in Revit. So just to give you a sense of what the level of detail and how I typically would create this, obviously this is the final sketch model, so you're not really seeing the iterations in here, but it's really basic and really simple. So if I click this, it's actually an in-place mass. Obviously, depending on your project and what you're doing, there may be other modeling sort of avenues you can take, but this is an in-place mass. If I go edit in place, you can see. And I actually even started with a box. So if I go to edit extrusion, you can see I did a box in plan view. And that's just because I had a very specific footprint that I wanted to use. And then from there, I started developing more pieces. So up on the top here, I created this little shed. I added a void in front here, and then another void on the bottom to create this sort of lip. And that sort of gave me the sense of the shape. And I started manipulating the angles and the depths of the different things. You can see on the back, I didn't even fill in that detail yet on this one. And if I click finish that model, what's cool about this project is that the other box is actually the exact same thing. It's just mirrored and skewed off to the left, I guess, in this view a little bit. And so this is essentially a sketch model. It's very simple, very basic. But then what I can do with this is that I can actually print it out. I can make views out of it. I can start studying it, and I can change it quickly. And so, you know, if for some reason I wanted to maybe modify the angle of this slope, just to see what that would look like, I can go in here. I can just change the angle of the slope, make it much steeper. Obviously, I created this as voids and extrusions, so I'm just going to edit a few of those voids and extrusions here. Probably click and pick this line, offset it by a foot, and you can see you can do things like this. You know, if you knew what that shape was going to be, and you wanted to make it sort of a parametric box and be able to flex these things, you can do that too. But the whole goal is to get this shape masked out in a 3-dimensional scaled view so that I can do things like create these very simple 3D views. So this is a great view to sketch over right here. Axon views are also great to sketch over. You can even throw in a floor plan with the mass, and you can export it something like this, so you have a scaled view of the floor plan once you've manipulated the mass. So again, this is taking that sketch, pulling it into Revit,
and modeling it as a very simple, what I call a sketched mass.
So in step 2, once I've created my sketch model in Revit, I'll print it out and I'll start tracing over it. And then I'll use that to develop more details. Now that it's scaled, I can create the views I want, I can create the images that I want, and now it's actually a scaled mass. And I'll start filling in some detail with my pen, and I might have to go back to the computer and modify some things, print it out again, roll the trace over it, sketch over it, and so on and so on. So it's an iterative process now between Revit and my hand and a piece of trace, and as I start filling in the details and figuring out how this design is going to develop. Once I've got to a point where I'm actually pretty happy with what I'm sketching by hand and maybe my mass in whatever level of detail it is in Revit, then it's time to move on to step 3. So now that I have a mass figured out, I've got some sketches of my detail. In step 3, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start detailing my Revit model so we can move on to step 4, which is going to be creating our actual presentation views. So in step 3, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take our mass, our sketch model, I should say, and we're going to, what I call it wrapping the mass, because a lot of times this is very exterior oriented, but it very well could be interior oriented. But what I'm talking about here is actually detailing your mass. So you're taking this block, which is your masked project, and you're adding things like doors, windows, mullions, curtain walls, whatever detail you can think of based on your project. So let's jump over to the computer now, and I'll show you exactly what I mean.
So at this point in time, we've taken our sketch model and we've modified it in Revit. We've manipulated it. We made some massing that we really enjoyed, and we've printed it out. We sketched on top of it with our freehand pens, pencils, etc., and trace paper. And so we have a sense of how we want to fill in this detail. So I just want to show you a couple of the cool things that I did to fill in the detail on this. So this was our sketch mass model. If I flip over, I have the final, and here's a little bit of a progress. And so you can see even in this progress, what I'm doing is I actually took that mass, I left it in place, and I voided it straight through. So if I go to edit in place, you can see there's a void, and that void is running straight through the mass. Because all I wanted was this shape, this sort of shed shape, to be dominant running through the building. And I left those as the walls just because, again, I needed to be quick, I needed to be simple. And what you'll notice is that if I select, if I go in this family and I click on the top left where it says family categories and parameters, if I click that, you'll see I changed the category of this to a wall. By default, it'll probably be a generic model or whatever you chose, I guess. But by clicking it as a wall, what's pretty cool is that if I get out of here, if I go and I place a door, you'll notice I can actually place doors in this in-place mass, which I thought was pretty cool. Again, not the greatest best practice. I wouldn't necessarily suggest it as we move forward. I'm going to eventually change this if I didn't already. And yeah, so what I did here is, again, I kept this mass as is. I started placing some curtain walls. So you can see this is a curtain wall on each side. I painted the inside with this nice plywood material. So if I go under modify, when I'm editing in this mass, I just went to the paint tool right here, which is PT on your keyboard. I clicked that and I was able to paint on the inside. And you'll also notice that I have these vertical lines running on the outside, and that's just a simple surface pattern. I've added some of these cross bracing, so on and so forth. The other thing I did when I get to the final model is I really wanted this vertical metal seam or standing metal seam to be prominent in the images and renderings. So if I go to the final example, what you see is I actually have those modeled. So I zoom way in here, I'll turn thin lines off so you can see. So I actually have these things completely modeled. So the way I did that is what I call the standing seam technique using curtain panels. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this real quick. And you can see this is just a mass. So by creating a curtain panel family, so if I go to curtain system, I can select faces. So here's the goofy part about Revit. So if you remember in the previous step, I converted the mass into walls so I can add doors to them. But you can't actually add a curtain system by face to the wall category. I know, it's bizarre, right? But what you can do is if I go to edit in place and I change the family category back to a generic model, for example, click finish, you'll see the door does some wonky stuff, which is okay for now. What we're going to do, it is still kind of cutting it, but what we're going to do is we're going to create our curtain system. So I'm going to do a curtain system. I'm going to pick my faces. Oops. Pick the faces. So there's my faces. I'm going to say create system. You can see there's my curtain system, which is a standing seam system. If you're interested in how I do this, I do have a video. I'll link it below where I dive deep into this standing seam curtain system. And then what I can do is I can go back into my family now, edit in place, change the category, back to walls, click finish, and now you'll notice the door goes back and the curtain panel stays. Crazy, I know, but I'm just flipping through categories to make that work. So now just to dissect what's here as I fill in the detail a little bit, you can see this is a nice railing family. There's some columns here. What I want you to notice in the back here is this wood slat wall, which is also a curtain panel, a curtain system. Again, if you're interested in how I create this, I also have a nice long tutorial on how to do that, which I'll link below as well. And then just a few other details. This is another curtain wall back here with a wall on the inside. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty basic. It's a very simple little project. So that's how I filled in the detail. And you could see, hopefully you could see how this initial sketch mass, which I'm going to select here, is beginning to develop into the actual building.
In step 1, we use trace or whatever medium you wanted to sketch out your project using your hand, nice and free flow. In step 2, we masked out our project in Revit, creating scaled masses, buildings, beams, whatever you want to talk about. We printed those out, we traced over them, we went back and forth going, sort of iterating our design until we got to something we were very happy with. In step 3, we took that mask now, we took those sketches, all that information together, and we actually started detailing our model. So now in step 4, we're at the point where we can start making our sexy Revit views. So one of the things with step 4 and 5 is, as you know, as an architect or a designer, you can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you present it poorly, no one's going to care. And the owner's probably not going to pick you. So in step 4, what we're going to do now is take our fully developed model and we're going to create a bunch of really sexy Revit views. By sexy Revit views, I'm talking about floor plans, sections, elevations, and so on. And so I'm going to walk you through the process that I use to create some of these really sexy views. I have some very specific techniques that I use for all of my shaded or hidden line views, as well as a really cool software that you may not have heard of to polish off the views at the end. So let's head over to the computer and I'll show you what I do.
So what I wanted to do is talk about a few little techniques that I've used to create these views. You'll notice all my views kind of have this different shaded look to them, and a few other little tips and tricks. So what I wanted to do is just show you sort of a before and after of, for example, the floor plan. So if I go to my floor plan, this is kind of your default Revit view right here. You can see there's not a lot of depth to it, not a lot of dynamicness. I guess that we'll use that word, sure. There's not a lot of life to these. But then when you add my techniques, this is sort of what you get. And I'm not going to give away all the techniques here. If you're really interested in creating your views and making them look as sexy as what you see here, then I really urge you to check out BIM After Dark Volume 1, which is my full-fledged course where I talk about all of my presentation techniques. But I will give you something here. So there's a couple things I'm doing in these views. One of them is called the 70-50-20 rule. That you're going to have to check out Volume 1 to learn. But I will tell you that one of the things I did is you'll notice here I've post-shaded the walls. And so just to do that, it's pretty simple. What you want to do is in your view, type VG in the keyboard, or VV if you want. And there's a couple different ways you could shade walls, doors, windows, and stuff, but this is one of the quickest ways to do it. If you select everything, I'm just clicking all here, and I go to my cut patterns, where I can click a little override. Doesn't matter which category I select, any category is good. I change my pattern to solid fill, and then I change it to black. Click OK, OK, apply, and OK. And there we go. So automatically we're already getting some depth to it. The other thing that I do always is I turn on anti-aliasing. which really helps smooth out your images. And then I apply what I call the 70-50-20 rule, which has to do with ambient shadows, lighting, and so on and so forth. And so that's what you get. And so if I look at my elevations, for example, here's sort of your stock default Revit elevation. You can see it's pretty flat, pretty bland. The only thing I've got going on here is the glazing is sort of this grayish blue color. And that I actually just did in the material for the glass. And so if you want to see how that is, I'll select my glass material. I'll pull it open here. And so what I did here is you can see I have a solid fill selected for my surface pattern, and then I have this nice RGB color here. That just kind of helps with glass, just to transition it. You know, if I didn't have that, you know, this would all be white. It'd be pretty rough. But then when you apply my techniques, which is the 70-50-20 rule, anti-aliasing, and a few other little tweaks, this is kind of what you would get. Ambient shadows is always on, anti-aliasing is always on. And so you can see how those little things sort of tweak the views dramatically. Same thing with all the three-dimensional views. If I go to my Axon views, you can see they've got this nice feel to them. And again, I got a few different views here, the back side, which is the north side. I guess I was sort of messing with the view here, but I think you get the idea. One of the things you may also notice when I was showing some of these images about exported from Revit, so if I do this, is you'll notice there's sort of this sketchy feel to them. You can see it almost looks like a watercolor or a sketched. It kind of adds a little detail, or adds a little depth to the images. Even here you can see, let me zoom in so you can get a sense of it. You can see it almost looks like it's a watercolor painting, and it kind of looks a little less rigid. So what I'm using for that is actually a program called Photo Sketcher, which is completely free and open source. It's FOTO Sketcher. I think I link it in the post below. So in order to do that, I'll just quickly run through it. So if I was to take this view, what I always do is I always export to JPEG. Please, please, please don't snip your Revit views using Windows Snippet and use those for your presentations. You're losing a ton of quality and it's just silly. So if you go under File, Export, Images, and Animations, and Images. I know it's a few clicks. I'm sorry, I didn't create the program, but you have to get through here. The nice thing about it is you can batch it. So if you have a bunch of images, you can batch them all together and export them at the same time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just export. I'm going to use JPEG lossless, this one view. I'm going to do something like 5,000 pixels wide. That should be plenty for what we need to do. I always check off hide unreferenced view tags in case you have unreferenced views. And for right now, I'm just going to throw these on my desktop. And you click OK. And that's it. So that exported a JPEG, but it also exported JPEG in high resolution, which is awesome. Okay. So now I'm going to open Photo Sketcher, which again is free and open source. I'll link it below. So here's Photo Sketcher. So what Photo Sketcher does is exactly what it sounds like. It takes photos and makes them sketchy. It really just applies a bunch of artist filters basically. So I'm going to go to File, Open a Picture. I'm going to open that picture I just exported. And I'm just going to show you what my typical settings are for those renderings and images that you've seen. So once I open a picture, it's going to open up my drawing parameters box. If I pull this down, you can see I have a bunch of cool effects. And you can scroll through them and get a sense of it. So the effect I always use is Painting 5, which is a watercolor effect. So if I click that. And now, kind of goofy, I know it's an open source program, so I'm not going to be too critical about it, but the viewing window is kind of rough. I think they're trying to reduce the amount of resources it uses, but it's kind of hard to see what you're doing. But this is showing you sort of a preview of what's happening. So what I will typically do is I'll actually turn down the strength of the effect to somewhere around 10 to 15. You'll also notice that the shadows kind of go away. That's just something that Photo Sketcher does. It tends to whitewash a lot of images. So you actually slide your darken / lighten down a little bit to the point where you at least get some shadows. And you can check some of your other images to make sure, some other parts of the images you could see. I'm getting some of my shadows back here. And then depending on what you want as far as the amount of brush strokes, you can see if I slide this back and forth, it's going to look a little more textured or a little less textured. And so that's usually what I play with a little bit. And that can be very stylistic, however you want it. So I'm liking those settings there. So now I'm simply going to click Draw. And now Photo Sketcher is going to draw my image. And I'll click close here. And now if I zoom in, you can see the difference there. So on the right hand side is PhotoSketch and the left hand side is Revit. So this is a very stylistic preference of mine. If you don't like it, you don't like it, but I promise you it ends up having a really, really nice feeling to your Revit shaded view. So I hope that's helpful.
So at this point, we've sketched our project, we've created a sketch mass in Revit, we've iterated that sketch mass back and forth until we got something we liked. We added our detail into Revit, so now we've got a Revit model that has all that detail that we all of our thoughts and ideas that we've sketched and details. And then we've created a bunch of floor plan sections, elevations, axons, diagrams, you name it. We created some awesome Revit sexy views. So there's one more thing that we need to do. We need to make some sexy renderings. In today's day and age, with the advancement of real-time rendering like Lumion, Enscape, Twinmotion, Autodesk Showcase, I think it's called. I don't even know what it's called anymore. I think it's Showcase. We've got all these real-time rendering, and even V-Ray has a real-time rendering engine now. We've got computing power that's basically endless. Our GPUs are out of control. So there's really no reason why we can't jump into a rendering at this early stage. Some people I know are against it, giving away too much detail and so on and so forth. But I gotta be honest with you, most clients, especially in the residential realm, don't understand a floor plan. They don't necessarily understand an axon. They can't see themselves living in an axon. They can't see themselves living in a floor plan. So those renderings are extremely important. I get when renderings used to take days and days to make and to change and so on and so forth, why maybe you wouldn't want to do that, or maybe you don't want to give away too much detail right away. I'm of the firm believer that we should. If you have an idea and you really want to present it, you go out there and you render this thing. So I use Lumion as my tool of choice. So Revit to Lumion workflow, we're going to jump into it right away. And I'm going to show you some examples of how on this project I developed my Lumion scene to create the renderings that you'll see in a minute.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about my Lumion and Revit workflow and show you what this Lumion scene looks like, sort of behind the scenes of the Lumion scene. But first I want to show you what the Revit scene looks like. So you can see here if I zoom in, there's my building. But there's our building here. This is actually sort of a quick mass of the existing house. You can get a sense of what it looks like, which is kind of cool. And then I created this topo. So this is a topo here. I just used a typical GIS interactive map because we didn't have a survey done yet. And you can see it gives you a nice sense. But this is going to be our base that we're going to build our Lumion model on. And this is actually going to be my export to Lumion view. So we've got our view set up. We've got everything turned down we want. And we just simply go over to Lumion. Click export. We're going to leave everything exactly where it is. If you want to turn the surface smoothing up, you can a little bit. Doesn't really matter. These are straight lines. And then we click export. We save our collada file where we want it to go. And then there it goes. Now we're just going to hop over to Lumion and I'm going to break down. First I'm going to show you how it comes in by default. And then I'm going to show you what we ended up with. So now that I'm in Lumion, before we jump into the actual scene, I'm just going to start a plain scene. I'm using Lumion 9. Lumion Pro 9.3.1. I believe Lumion 5 9.5 is out. I just haven't installed it yet. But I just want to show you what this actually looks like before I tweak it and do everything that we did to it. So if I go to imports in Lumion, I import a new model. I go down to my collada file and I open it. There's already one there, so it's yelling at me. I'm just going to throw it in here anyways. So now you'll notice I have this huge, and then just place it. There we go. Huge mass. And this is basically how it's going to come in. Oh. Let me zoom in a little bit. Here you go. So this is what your Lumion scene will probably look like before you do anything to it. So there's our Revit model. I didn't actually create very many materials in Revit because I knew I was using Lumion for the rendering, so this is what it is. So a couple things that I do before we get to the final scene is I'll typically obviously change the earth to the materials of everything, I should say. I'm starting with the earth, but in order to change the materials in Lumion, you just go over to materials. Let's click the site earth. Lumion 9 has this fantastic 3D grass that you can work with. It looks awesome and it's very, very efficient on your computer. I'm just going to add some wild grass first. So you can see we got some grass there. If we double click the wild grass, we can actually change lots of settings like the size of it, which is pretty cool. Is it cut or not, which is kind of neat. The roughness, and colorization, different sort of things like that. So like if we wanted to really crank this up, you can see there's our grassy knoll. Pretty neat. So there's our 3D grass, and then I'll go through and I'll just apply different materials to this stuff. So we have an exterior wall. We have a glass setting here. If I click the glass, I can go to outdoor, use pure glass. Little tip for everyone here that I like to show when I'm teaching Lumion is if you double click the pure glass, you have a bunch of nice settings. One of the settings that's really cool is called relief. I'm going to make it really dramatic here, but for those of you who have followed my blog over the past few years, you'll notice I have a glazing technique inside of Revit that basically does the same thing, because as you all know, when you look at the reflection of glass, it's very rarely ever a perfect sheet of glass. There's usually some convex or concave to it. So what you can do is you can actually change the relief and then bump up the scale. So I'm modifying the relief and bumping up the scale, and you sort of get this awesome little wave in your glass, which is extremely realistic looking. So then I just went through, added a bunch of materials to all of my stuff here. I'm not going to add them all right now. I'm going to jump over to the scene, but I just wanted to show you what I would do. I'd add the materials, make sure you click Save Changes. I'd hop over to my objects, and then I'd start having some fun with Lumion objects. So placing some trees. You can see how easy it is to place some trees, place some bushes, plants, cars, etc., whatever you need. And that's it. You start building your scene and you're good to go. And so what I'm going to do now is flip over to the actual scene, and then I'm going to show you some of the cool things about how I set that up. So you can see the rendering and then sort of see the behind the scenes of the rendering. Okay, so here we are. We're in my scene. So just as a little reminder, let me open up the rendering so you can see. So this is our final rendering of the south facade. If I flip through, here's a couple different renderings. You can see what they look like. Check out the blog post below to see more. But I just wanted to show you now. So here's my actual scene. So if I zoom out, you can see a little behind the scenes. So it looks pretty cool. Looks like we're in this desolate wood, but the reality is that's it. I've got some trees. Everything else there's nothing there. It's magic. So you see what I did is I actually went through and I placed a lot of neat stuff here. So I had some good photos of the site. I've been there a couple times, obviously, so I knew where I wanted some trees to be and so on. And then I wanted to sort of fade off into the distance. So the first thing I did is I added a lot of these rocks. So you can see all these rocks down here. You can see there's some leaves. I painted the surface a little bit. I put some lower ground trees and brushes, which is what you see in here. If I go to nature, you can see all the trees here. A bunch of different trees, bunch of different rocks, and so on and so forth. And then if I jump over to my photo view, you can see here's that image, and you could actually start to get a sense of how that image was put together. So the big thing with Lumion when it comes to getting from what you see here, with nothing really to write home about, to what you see here, and then to what you see here, is it's all about the effects. Okay, so you'll notice as I go into the south view, I've got 2 levels of effects right here. Okay, so the effects are extremely important. The effects are what Lumion does to really add realism, but you can add a lot of different things. So you can see here I added autumn colors, outlines, analog color lab. I've added all these things. So what I wanted to do real quickly is show you, if I was to turn all of these effects off and then turn them back on and roll forward, you're going to see how dramatic the change is. Okay, so I just rolled all the effects off. Here's your default view. So as I turn these effects on, depth of field, not too much change there, but what I did is I actually have the building is in focus and the background is blurred a little bit. Turn on chromatic aberrations. I don't need to get into what that is right now. If you want to look it up, feel free. Another thing with depth of field, if you'll notice on the front right hand corner here, there's some leaves and stuff. There's a little tree that was very purposefully done. They blur out just to make sort of foreground and background change. Shadows. Notice by turning the shadow effect on, it actually does soft shadows if I turn that on and off. Extremely awesome. Skylight 2. You won't see that here, but it actually does. It's kind of like a global illumination sort of thing. Hyperlight is the same idea. You won't see it in the preview. Reflection. Reflection is huge. We want to turn on reflection, and you'll notice the reflections in our glass here. They're going to reflect either the world, or they're going to reflect actual objects in your scene. So you want to make sure that's on. Color correction, you can see how much of an effect that has. Color correction is very simple. It's temperature, tint, brightness, contrast. So you get to do some sort of post-processing stuff almost right away. Exposure, just making it brighter if need be. 2-point perspective, obviously very important when you're doing views like this, and you'll see it's not extremely intense with this view, but it does help. It straightens out your image. Precipitation. So this one's kind of cool. So what I do with precipitation here is that if I wanted to, I can actually slide this this bar, and I can make it rain or snow. And I can also turn on the actual rain particles. But if you don't use the rain particles, what you can do is you can actually make it sort of a wet scene, and so it adds reflectivity over some elements. Real skies, you'll notice that's a pretty dramatic change. That's basically an HDRI sky, if you're familiar with what that means. And so then whatever sky map you choose as the background will have a lighting effect on your entire scene. So see how dramatic that was when I turned it on and off. Fog, pretty simple there. I just added fog to add in the distance. Analog Color Lab is just a filter that adds a little bit of desaturation. I like to add outlines. This is a preference thing. But it adds this sort of almost sketchy look to some of your images, and so I'll turn that on and off again. It's kind of subtle, but it really helps define some of the forms. And then autumn colors, that allows you to desaturate an entire layer, like your trees and so on and so forth. And so there we go. There's our effects. And then it's as simple as clicking render photos. You render out the photos, and then you get yourself a nice set of renderings. So this is what the default raw rendering looked like. Let me pull this a little larger for you guys. So you can see we got some nice effects. There's still definitely some room for improvement. And so what I've done there is I'll actually throw it into Photoshop, and I'll do a few edits to it. And so here's after Photoshopping. You can see I'm pulling out the textures. I'm messing with some of the levels. If you're very interested in my post-processing process, definitely check out BIM After Dark Volume 1, which again, it will be linked below. And I get in depth about my 10-minute post-processing process. And so this is what you're seeing here. And then finally, I will usually, depending on the level of detail, I will probably photo sketch it. Very similar to the photo sketching I showed before, and here's the final image here. And so if I go backwards, there's the edits, there's the raw, there's the edits, and there's the photo sketcher.
So there we have it. We just went through 5 steps of my design process using Revit to create a residential project. What I hope that you've taken away from this is that Revit can be an integral part of your design process, as well as pens, pencils, trace, in whatever medium it is. It just becomes another tool in your toolkit. I hope by sort of pulling back the curtain and breaking down how I designed a real-world project, it helps you have some ideas of how you can incorporate the same thing. Like I said before, please subscribe to this channel if you really enjoyed this video. Make sure you check out BIM After Dark Volume 1. I'm really excited about it. It's 10 plus years of me developing presentation techniques, the quickest way to get to things. As I mentioned in the video, I have a 10-minute post-production process. I'm all about efficiency, so I really think you'll be interested in it. If you like the images, the renderings, the floor plans that you saw in this video, you can learn how to do all of them in my video tutorial series. So check it out. Check out all the links below, as well as the revitkid.com for more information. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.